And this is something that I touch on in the moral landscape. It's true that with almost any complex question, we can't know at the end of the day what all the consequences are going to be, and the consequences can be extremely good or extremely bad in unforeseen ways, and all we can do is make our best effort to navigate in the space of possible experience based on what we think is reasonably likely to occur. So one example that I've been using that is recently in the news is you look at something like the nuclear disaster in Japan that happened this year. That you put a frame around that looks like an intrinsically bad thing, and anyone who would consciously, intentionally engineer that would be a criminal who we'd want to lock away forever. I mean, this has been a circumstance of immense human suffering. But a skeptic of consequentialism could always say, well, but look, if you take a kind of a wide enough shot of this event, who knows what its actual effects are? What if it causes us to be far more careful with nuclear materials than we would ever otherwise have been? What if it winds up saving millions of lives in the end, later in this century? What if 50 years from now we'll look back at this year as just a turning point in our kind of wise stewardship of destructive technology? We can't know in advance that that's not going to occur. So it seems to make a mockery of this whole calculus. So you don't know, you can't know even if the worst nuclear accident in memory is bad. Therefore, you can't know if anything is good or bad in the end. Well, that kind of skepticism about not knowing the valence of various outcomes in human life, I think it's impossible to act on. I mean, we can only act on what we think is plausibly going to be good or bad. It's also very hard to argue that is even if this nuclear disaster does have all of these good secondary effects, it's very hard to argue that would be the best way to have engineered those effects. We could have all gotten around a conference table and made a sane nuclear policy with just the hypothetical casualties, without the actual suffering and death and economic destruction. So it's very hard to argue that the bad things that have good consequences are the only things that could have those good consequences. So, but my argument in the moral landscape is purpose toward having making a deeper claim and for us having a deeper foundation for our moral concern. And the claim is this: whether or not we can figure these things out, whether or not we can get answers in practice, we have to admit that there are answers in principle, because there are an infinite number of questions for which we can't get answers in practice, and yet we know there are answers in principle. And this is what science is. Science is conducted in the context of our knowing that there's a background reality that has a certain character that we don't understand. And we know that we can be right or wrong with respect to our beliefs about it, and we can't always know whether we're right or wrong. So too with the possibilities of experience. We know that the universe admits of certain experiences. We know that some of these experiences are terrible, and we know that some of them are sublimely happy. So we know that there's a spectrum. We know that navigating in this space is not entirely haphazard. We know that suffering arises based on certain psychophysical principles. In our case, it has everything to do with the structure of the human brain and what we do in this world, and how the kinds of social systems we build, and the kind of influences we engineer in human life, the kinds of cultures we have, the kinds of conversations we have with one another. So we know that it's possible for life to get really bad. Just how bad, perhaps we don't know, but we know when we're looking down at failed states like Congo or complete upheavals of culture like world wars. We know that these are places not worth going. And we frankly don't know how good it could get, but we know that it could get a lot better than it has for most people most of the time. And so this is a domain of right and wrong answers. This is a domain about which people can form beliefs that are clearly erroneous. So you look at a culture like, again, they're my favorite example, the Taliban. I mean, these are people who are struggling mightily, making heroic self-sacrifice to build a culture that is obviously terrible, that is terrible for everyone in it. It's terrible even for the men in it. And yet I'm continually running into intellectuals in the first world and liberals and even liberal women who are open-minded about the legitimacy of Taliban goals and culture, and where the strongest thing they'll say against it is, I wouldn't like it and I wouldn't want to live there, but if that's how they want to live or they have their values, this to my eye is a complete abdication of kind of intellectual honesty, but it's also a failure of compassion. It's a failure to actually connect with how bad and unnecessary the suffering is in those places. And so I'm arguing for right and wrong answers to the question of how human beings can flourish, whether or not we can actually get those answers in any narrow frame view of any question about public policy or anything else. Okay, there's actually a question about my future research from Hermes the Messenger. What kind of questions am I asking, and wanted to know about my current and future research. We're actually planning now to do another fMRI study on belief, but in this case we're looking at why it's so difficult for people to change their minds. This actually goes back to a question I answered earlier. It seems to me a bit of a mystery that people are unable to really value and accede to counter-argument and counter-evidence in real time, even though they go away and do it in private rather often. There's this, clearly people marshal a lot of resources, emotional resources, to resist counter-arguments and counter-evidence. And liberals and conservatives do it. It's not, nobody has a monopoly on self-deception and self-serving biases. But I want to look at what mechanisms in the brain actually control our resistance to counter-evidence, our defense of our cherished beliefs. And I also want to look at what it means to successfully change one's mind about on points of belief in neurophysiological terms. So those moments where you resist despite a wealth of evidence, so kind of what dogmatism looks like in real time, and those moments where you actually cave in and have your views about the world modulated successfully. That's something that we're going to do a neuroimaging study on soon, and actually my foundation, Project Reason, is going to fund that. And that, it seems to me, is not only an interesting question, but it strikes me as perhaps the most consequential question. I don't think that the neuroimaging component of it is necessarily the only or most consequential piece, but the most consequential phenomenon we're dealing with, I think, in human culture is the fact that we can't successfully talk to each other. We can't successfully change one another's views in anything like real time based on reasoned argument. We have these echo chambers where you have, in the political sphere, you have Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Having conversations about all manner of things, the economy being especially consequential at this moment. And you get the sense that there's nothing that one side can say to the other, let's say on the desirability of raising or lowering taxes. You get the sense that there's nothing that they could say to the other. There's no panel of economists marshaled on either side or in between that could get the two camps to persuade one another. And there have to be right or wrong answers in this space about in the question of what to do vis-a-vis taxes. And so I think there's something about this breakdown of self-criticism and intellectual honesty and an openness to rational argument that is, while we celebrate it in the ivory tower and in public discourse generally as this common tool we use all the time, we rely on it as this is essential, rational discourse, rational argument, this is the best of us. I think I can count on one hand the number of times in my life I've seen someone stripped of their cherished opinion in real time, under pressure, in the face of counter-argument. And so it's incredibly consequential that we don't have more humility and more openness to radical changes of opinion in the public sphere, because what then happens is a complete failure of decision-making and policy-making. So I'm going to try to get a neuroscientific handle on it probably sometime in the next 12 months. With that, I think I want to wrap up my, my Reddit answer session. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry it took so long to get these answers to you. And again, I'd like to thank Mahalo and my friend Jason Calacanis for giving the studio time. It's made it very easy to do. Thank you very much.